Following a launch event in Manchester, the second in a series of Department for Education debates sees experts and historians debating whether Europe stumbled accidentally into war in 1914. Much of the scholarly debate about the causes of the First World War has revolved around whether Germany was solely responsible for planning and instigating the war, or whether this conflagration that nobody wanted was brought about by errors on the part of statesmen and generals across Europe. In the second of a series of debates organised by the Department for Education, Sir Hugh Strachan of St Andrews University and Professor Annika Mombau from the Open University, Tara Finn FCO and Professor John Horn from Trinity College Dublin examined each argument in front of an audience of students from London schools. The debate took place at London's Imperial War Museum and was chaired by Jane Corbin.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome. My name is Jane Corbin, and I'm a reporter for the BBC's Panorama programme. I have covered many wars across the globe in the past couple of decades, from Afghanistan and Iraq to the recent war in Gaza, the so-called Arab Spring and its fallout, and many Arab, Israeli, Palestinian and Israeli conflicts in recent years. I also covered the wars in Bosnia and the former Yugoslavia, perhaps closer to the Great War because of the origin of Serbia there. But tonight we're here in London for a debate on the Great War, the second in a series of 12 debates which are happening all around the country as part of the centenary commemorations. We've got Hugh Strachan on my left here. We've got Professor Annika Mombau on the end here, Professor John Horn next to her, and Tara Finn. So I'm going to start by asking everybody on the panel here a question. I have to say, if any of you want to butt in at any point or ask something, you've got to become quite, aggressive. Put your hand up and, stand up if necessary. So we'll bat it around amongst ourselves for a bit, and then we're going to take some questions from some of you who've already put them in and ask you to talk as well. But perhaps we could start with something general. And Hugh, do you think that blame is a useful way of looking at the causes and responsibility when we come to the outbreak of the Great War?
Well, you used the word in the question at the end of responsibility, and I suppose what we've done over the passage of time is moved to the notion that there should be some form of responsibility here. Blame was there at the very beginning because it became part of the propaganda effort during the course of the war. So there was a clear understanding on both sides between 1914 and 1918 that others should be held to account for what had happened. And it was then embodied in the peace settlements after the war was over. So the notion of blame has been there all the time. Christopher Clark, in his recent book, The Sleepwalkers, has argued that we should move beyond this and we should stop looking for blame. Absolutely, I share with him the view that there is a collective responsibility. It takes two sides to have a war, and simply to blame one side does not actually help you understand why war itself breaks out. But if you go so far as to say that blame then should be so removed that actually you're no longer seeking responsibility, then you move too far. These are statesmen. They are trying to control, manage and understand, and perhaps to manipulate a crisis in July 1914. They therefore have to have some responsibility.
Would you agree with that, John?
Yes, I would. I think that one of the reasons why, as Hugh says, that blame became instantly so important was, and we're perhaps coming back to this in other questions, nobody understood the kind of war that this was going to be. But once it had happened, the scale of the bloodshed and then the gradual length of the war meant that each year that the war went on, the blame piled up retrospectively. And so one of the difficulties for historians is that we have, as it were, to put out of our mind everything that happened after the beginning of August 1914 when we're trying to reconstruct the responsibilities of the individuals whose decisions led to that war. The other thing I would just say is that throughout there's been an alternative approach, which is not to think of it in terms of individual responsibilities, but deep-seated causes. It was imperialism. It was the arms race. It was the balance of power. And those deep-seated causes obviously have some kind of relationship to the question. But for me, one of the crucial things is, how do we connect the two? How do we relate the decisions that individuals actually took with these deep-seated forces of history? What's the connection between them?
Tara, you mentioned that in your preamble, that there are so many subjects here, social history, etc. What about that point that John makes about causes and deep-seated causes?
I think, as he said, we all look for a responsibility to blame someone, and immediately after the war, a number of countries rushed to produce documents and books to show how they were completely blameless. But it's unhelpful, because what we need to do is look at what we did. We can't just look at what everyone else did and say, oh, well, they were responsible. You can find book after book saying Russia, every country, you can find book after book saying this country or this country or this country was responsible. And it's far, far more complex.
And Annika, John's point is right. And in fact, you said it, the sleepwalking aspect. Nobody knew how this war would develop and the great war that it would become. And therefore it is hard to put ourselves back at the beginning and apportion blame.
I think it's also really important to understand that there is nobody at all in the summer of 1914 who wants the war that it ends up being. Whatever different statesmen and military leaders wanted to get out of the crisis, nobody in their wildest dreams imagined anything quite as terrible as this, although they knew it wouldn't be a walk in the park, and they had a sense that it would be the worst war they had ever seen. Nobody wanted a world war like the war it became. But your point about the sort of structural explanations, the isms, if you like, I think the isms come into play once it's no longer helpful to talk about guilt. So once the immediate post-war phase is over, and for the Allies, the victorious Allies, Germany needs to be a potential friend again rather than a former enemy. That's when you look at the underlying structures rather than individuals, because that's more helpful by way of an explanation then.
Just briefly respond to that, and I agree with that completely. So, to follow your argument, in 20s and 30s, people who want to make friends again, people who want to get over the war, start talking about the deep-seated causes, which in a sense lets everybody off the hook in terms of responsibility. So Lloyd George in his memoir has that wonderful phrase, because he reaches for the deep causes because he wants peace in Europe. And so he says, so if I was to assess the guilt of all those responsible in 1914, the men who made the decisions, he says, I would hold them guilty of manslaughter rather than murder. And yet the interesting thing is, as we were saying earlier, that desire for history of individual responsibilities, which is how we live our own political life. You know, we couldn't live in a functioning democracy unless we assumed that those who hold power could make real decisions and were held accountable for them, means that kind of explanation in terms of the individual responsibilities is still there, isn't it? And so we're still left with this question. We can see the deep-seated causes, we can see the individual decisions, but what actually relates to them?
And if I, just to follow on that point, if you read Christopher Clark's book, The Sleepwalkers, it is full of personalities. It is full of individuals who all are deemed to have important roles. The issue is the interaction between those individuals and how well or how ineffectively they're managing to communicate with each other.
Which perhaps brings us on to the question of diplomacy. You know, what is the balance here between diplomatic manoeuvres that were going on at the time and national sentiment and what everybody was essentially in it for in terms of their own interest?
Well, in a way, the conventional understanding is absolutely driven by diplomatic documents. It is to do with diplomats. It is to do with ambassadors. And significantly, of course, in July 1914, because it's the holiday season and because some people are ill and others have died, not all ambassadors are in place at the vital moment. It's also the case, of course, and I come back to what I just said about communication, is that if you're communicating from one capital to another as a diplomat, if you're communicating as the ambassador, the Austro-Hungarian ambassador, who actually isn't there, but if he had been there because he's away, from St. Petersburg back to Vienna, he has to encipher what he's saying. It has to be decoded when he gets there, when he gets to Vienna, and then there's a lapse of time. And by that stage, because the crisis is very foreshortened at the end of July 1914, by that stage, the crisis itself has moved on. Events are proceeding faster than these people can bring it under control. And this is where one of the isms comes in, because public appetite for news is very great. You're dealing with a Europe where levels of literacy are much higher than 100 years before, where there is compulsory primary education in most states, and where there is access to print media and an appetite for up-to-date news. And so public opinion is in many cases running ahead of or independently of where politicians are. Politicians then, diplomats then, complain about the media taking charge of events just like they do today. Nothing much, it's extraordinary how much like 21st century politicians some of them sound in July 1914.
Okay. Now, well, we've got a question actually from Chris Louis from Aylesbury Grammar School. I don't know, Chris, if you're out there. Can we get a microphone to you? Yeah, that's great. Because you've got a question relating to Edward Grey, and it fits probably into the diplomacy envelope here that we're talking about.
Hi. I just wondered if the panel thought that the British Foreign Secretary Edward Grey and the British in general did enough to try and prevent the outbreak of war in 1914.
Annika?
That's a good question. Well, I might be disagreeing here with some of my panelists, I'm not sure. I think no matter what Grey did, the outcome was not really his to influence in the end, because from my point of view, there are people in Vienna and in Berlin who are bent on using this crisis for their own aims and who will not stop at anything. And who certainly won't be stopped by Sir Edward Grey. So he seems to me somebody who is trying his hardest, really, to prevent this war from breaking out. But his hands really are tied. I mean, there is lots of documents to show that in Berlin they think, they say, we might as well have the English, as they always call them when they talk about Britain. We might as well have them there because it'll be more fun with them. They won't really be able to influence the outcome. So there's a complete disregard for what Britain could do in terms of its military prowess. And so I think his hands, in a sense, are tied. But I'm sure
Was Vienna to blame then? You said Vienna and Berlin.
Well, in my opinion, they are more to blame than the other big nations, Germany and Austria-Hungary. That's not to say that they are blameless, but in my opinion, until you get to the ultimatum, that part of the ultimatum to Serbia, which really is in the end the trigger of the war, following the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand. That period between the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand and the ultimatum on the 23rd of July, that part of the crisis is made entirely in Vienna and in Berlin, where there is scheming behind the scenes, where they're trying to pretend nothing's going on and they're trying to pull the wool over everyone's eyes. After the ultimatum, I think the decisions that are taken in St. Petersburg and in Paris, and to some extent in London, also contribute to an escalation of the crisis. But that there is a crisis, in my opinion, is to do with the decisions being taken in Vienna and in Berlin. And as I say, there people are bent on war, and so in a sense, Sir Edward Grey really can't prevent this war breaking out.
John?
Yeah, no, I mean, I would agree with Annika that Grey's margin of manoeuvre is limited, and I think from the French and the Russian point of view, Britain was a kind of ally, but it wasn't quite clear what the nature of the agreement was. They were certainly relieved that Britain came in, but they were going to do what they did anyway, whether Britain came in or not. But I think I find the question really interesting from the British perspective is that it seems to me one of those pivotal moments that Britain, on the one hand, was part of the concert of power in Europe. That's to say, part of that organisation of the great powers where they try to manage regional crises so that they don't become major wars. And this, for many in Britain, was a way of keeping Britain out of Europe. At the same time, through the crisis, because it set the balance of power, or it destroyed the balance of power and set the two camps against each other, it was the moment of decision. And Britain, in the end, decided in favour of entry. So in that sense, I think in the long-term view of British foreign policy, it was an absolutely pivotal crisis.
I think one of the things we're probably going to find is that most people will agree Edward Grey tried to avoid war. He didn't want it. The question is almost, did he do the right things? He was going off making bilateral relationships, kind of giving a sense of a promise where he didn't really have the right to without consulting with cabinet. There's this ambiguity about whether Britain will join or not. And of course, one of the counterfactual questions is if we've been clear about saying, no, we will be supporting France, whether that would have changed the outcome. Possibly not, but I don't think he perhaps is entirely blameless.
Okay. Well, Annika raised the assassination of Franz Ferdinand, which I think if you asked anybody, is the moment that everybody will tell you was the trigger. Of course, it's a lot more complicated than that. Now, we've got the Charter School here, and they've come up with a joint question about the assassination. Could we have somebody from the school to read the question to the panel, please? And someone from the Charter School?
The success of the assassination of Franz Ferdinand came through a number of elements of chance. The wrong route taken by the driver, the car stalling, and the fact Prince happened to be in the right spot at the right time. Should chance and accident ever be considered when historians are exploring historical problems such as the causes of the First World War?
You.
The short answer is yes, absolutely. It comes back to John's point about isms, actually. I mean, in the 60s, it was very fashionable to see the outbreak of the First World War as, in inverted commas, a product of inevitability. In other words, the car going down the quay and whether we'd gone the right road or the wrong road really wouldn't have made any difference, because in the end, world forces were such that there was going to be a war anyway. And for a Marxist, that this was a crisis for imperialism, a crisis for capitalism, and the powers were going to fall out. Marxism, of course, has gone somewhat out of fashion since the end of the Cold War, and the argument about determinism of that sort probably attracts far fewer supporters. When I was an undergraduate, to argue that chance and contingency mattered was, in inverted commas, a Tory view of history. But I would absolutely be with you. If that makes me a Tory historian, I don't. But I would argue that chance certainly matters. This specific incident, is that enough? I mean, if there had been no assassination, if you want to do a counterfactual question, no assassination of Franz Ferdinand, if he got out of Sarajevo alive, would there still have been a war? I think the Austro-Hungarian Empire is confronting an existential crisis. Annika was asked the question about Vienna specifically. And there is a real challenge here, because its domestic policy, its future as an empire, its future in terms of how it manages the national components of that empire, relate directly to its foreign policy. There are far too many nationalities who have loyalties either side of its frontiers, and at some point it is going to have to confront those. And broadly speaking, I think it has reached a situation where a limited war, that war happens to be a limited war in the Balkans, is an option that it is probably going to want to pursue. Famously, the Austro-Hungarian Chief of the General Staff urged war on many occasions, both against Serbia and against Italy. And what he, of course, had not really fully confronted is the possibility that a local limited Balkan war could turn into a world war.
Tara, chance and accident?
Absolutely. Otherwise, we're thinking that everything is purpose, predestined. You know, it is far more random than we like to think.
Do either of you disagree?
No, but I just always wonder with the counterfactuals, what would have happened if just Franz Ferdinand's wife had been shot that day? I think that'd be an interesting one to think.
And there is a problem with the counterfactuals that we advance. We need to keep them in mind because they always tell us about the contingency of what happens in history. But the problem is the moment you advance 3 steps down the road about the turn of history that might have been, then you're into complete guesswork. For example, Franz Ferdinand, had he survived, was the great advocate of a federal solution for the dual monarchy, which was one way of resolving peacefully the problems that Hugh was talking about. So contingency, accident, absolutely. Tolstoy is wonderful on this in War and Peace. That is the theme of the novel in a way, and he takes on the historians over this issue. And it seems to me that we can perhaps talk, I mean, I like to talk about sort of weak causality and strong causality, and I think that for me the crisis in 1914 was really one ultimately of weak causality. And then we have the question of what we do with all the isms we were talking about, and I think where they come roaring in is the moment that the war has broken out. They help determine the nature of the war, this transformational war that it turns out to be, and hence this enormous gulf between the rather weak causation of the war in 1914 and the animal that war turns out to be. But if I was to look for a connecting point, I mean, sort of putting in a slightly different way Hugh's point, I think what I would say is that there are a number of different kinds of war, ways of thinking about war, which are there in the mindsets in 1914. And one is the imperial one and managing the framework of empire. And that's what Austria-Hungary is doing, managing its borders because it's faced with decline. And the other is the emergence of the kind of nationality principle, which is the right of nation-states to constitute themselves. France had done it, the French Revolution, the Italians and the Germans had done it mid-century, and now the Balkan powers were doing it. And that clash is written into the conflict between Serbia and Austria-Hungary. And it's at that point that a regional crisis becomes linked because Vienna, Austria-Hungary, is a major power into the European balance of power. And it's that linkage of the regional to the European balance of power which turns what might have been a limited war into a great war.
I mean, broadening it out from the countries that you've mentioned from Europe. Hugh, what did the belligerent countries in the broader sense of those involved want from war in 1914?
Well, I think
Turkey and looking wider.
Many of them, of course, didn't want war. And you also beg the question, which is what sort of war? I mean, we've already opened up the possibility that Austria-Hungary might have been interested in having a limited war. Though, as John absolutely right said, if Franz Ferdinand had survived, they might have avoided that, and he would have sacked Konrad von Hotzendorf. Perhaps he had done it before; he might have done it again. And of course, when Grey, we've talked about already, stands up in front of the House of Commons on the 3rd of August, he says to the assembled MPs that whether Britain's in this war or out of this war will make very little difference, because he says as a maritime and trading country, Britain will be involved in a war, will be affected by the war, whatever happens. Its trade will be disrupted, there will be consequences. And he too holds out a vision of a limited war, even at that stage, because he says we will fight it as a sea power. At that point, the cabinet is against the view that the British Expeditionary Force would go to France. It imagines that it will be used for the security of the empire. And of course, for the other belligerents, and for Britain's allies particularly, it is the Navy that is going to be the big contributor that Britain will provide. So we have very different visions of the war. If we go from one extreme to the other, from Austria-Hungary at the beginning of the crisis and Britain at the end of the crisis, both of them have visions of this war that bear no relationship to the sort of war they're going to be landed up with. And I think that is part of the problem, that the imagining of what this war would be like, although certainly Dyer, and Grey is one of those who, of course, is deeply depressed by the outbreak of the war. And there are plenty of people who imagine this will be a significant conflagration and will last for some considerable time. The imaginations, nonetheless, in relation to this war, are extraordinarily divorced from what actually happens in practice. And in part, I'm perhaps speaking too long, but in part that is because of a lack of liaison between those who are the soldiers, the general staff officers who are being asked to think about this war in advance, and those who are taking the political decisions.
I'm just going to throw it open to the floor here. Somebody has the Turkish question has been posed. I mean, if we're talking about reasoning and cause. Serena from Southend School, are you there?
Yeah.
Yeah, would you like to ask a question, please?
To what extent was the collapse of the Ottoman Empire the main reason for World War I?
Tara.
Oh, I was hoping one of the grown-up historians was going to be asked this one.
It's your turn.
It's a good question. We were discussing it earlier. It depends how central you see the Balkans to it. You know, this was not the first war in the Balkans. This was not even the second war. There's this continuity, and it contributes to that uncertainty. It contributes for Austria-Hungary to that sense of what is happening to my empire. How do I keep it under control? How do I deal with this neighbour that we're not getting on with? So. Certainly to the eastern side, it's incredibly important. It's not what France, what Britain are saying. It's what's happening there, and that relationship to the Ottoman Empire.
I mean, in particular, of course, as a result of the Balkan Wars, Serbia becomes this new powerhouse in the Balkans, and that is crucial if you're sitting in Vienna and you're looking at that empire that Tara was talking about, because here is a threat. You've got within the Austro-Hungarian Empire many nationalities, including Serbs, and within Serbia, this move towards a greater pan-Serbian movement. And so, therefore, what happens to the Ottoman Empire has a direct influence on what happens then in the Balkans, and the assassination of Franz Ferdinand, obviously linked to the Serbian government with no evidence really to back that up at the time. So that's the connection to the immediate causes of the war.
John, just a brief comment, and then Hugh, we'll keep it moving.
Yeah, just a very brief comment. Firstly, in the wonderful satirical Czech novel, The Good Soldier Švejk, who's a brilliant idiot, imagines that the assassination has been caused by the Turks. That's his understanding of the outbreak of the First World War. In fact, Ottoman Turkey comes into the war not until the end of October, beginning of November 1914, and that's a reminder to us that the July crisis and what happens at the beginning of August is only the first round of entries. It shapes the war, but there are second and third round entries, of which the Ottoman Empire is one. My final point would be that, in a way, much of the tension which underlies the outbreak of the First World War is to do with the decline of the dynastic empires that Annika was talking about, which is the Russian Empire, Austria-Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire. Each of them faced with the threats of nationality and claims of nations within those imperial borders. And I think that Austria-Hungary, in a way, inherits the problems of the Ottoman Empire. And paradoxically, Russia just as much champions Slav nationalism. And so they find themselves on opposite sides of that particular conflict in Eastern Europe.
Very specific point. 1911, the second Moroccan crisis, which many see as one of the key crises in the lead up to the July crisis in 1914, is itself linked to the problems of the Ottoman Empire in Libya, and the challenge that the Ottoman Empire faces then has two effects. One, of course, is to leave the Ottoman Empire exposed in the Balkans, and the Balkans then becomes this sequence of wars, which Tara has already referred to, of which the First World War is the third. And secondly, means that what happens in North Africa, which could be seen as an imperial problem, the source of tensions between the great powers, which have been largely contained and seen as outside Europe, because the Ottoman Empire is both of Europe and of North Africa, it acts as the link that brings those crises from the southern Mediterranean into the northern Mediterranean and into the Balkans. I'm beginning to sound slightly 2016 in what I'm saying, but there is the Italian invasion of Libya, an Ottoman possession, which is their exploitation of the Moroccan crisis, then has consequences that reverberate around the rest of the Mediterranean seaboard.
Thank you. I'm going to move on a bit to a more general question, but again, if anybody wants to come in, please put up your hand and make yourself known. What, if anything, is the role of military planning and thinking about future war in the context of what we're discussing today? Annika.
Well, perhaps I could answer that by looking at the German example. So military planning is crucial in a state like Wilhelmine, Germany, which is so focused on everything military. It's very much a society shaped by the Kaiser's military interests, if you like. And Germany, of course, conceives of itself as being encircled by hostile powers. So very quickly you end up developing a military plan which is seen as the way out of this perceived encirclement, because Germany is not strong enough to defeat enemies on two fronts. So once you've got a diplomatic situation where you've got Britain and France in an entente, France and Russia in an alliance, and essentially with Britain joining Russia in an entente as well in 1907, you can see how you're encircled. So this military plan, which relies on speed in particular and surprise in order to work at all, becomes in a sense the not the cause of the war, but the overriding thought that determines everything that is decided in Berlin in July 1914. You have got to put this plan into place. It has got to be done at a certain time. And so you've got that part of military thinking, which is really important. But on the other hand, you have military thinking, which basically says, and it's very difficult for us to understand that today, but you've got to put yourself into a situation before world wars that says that having a war is in a way a good thing. It's inevitable. It is part of being human. And there are lots of military thinkers and planners who regret the fact that a war hasn't happened while they've been in office, and who hope that a war will happen before they retire. So you've got that sort of imperative of the war plan, and you've also got thinking in the backs of a lot of people's minds that war is not a bad thing.
Tara, can you enlarge on that beyond Germany?
Certainly, war was seen as a diplomatic tool. It wasn't just oh my gosh, the failure of diplomacy. It was a clear the air kind of phenomenon.
The role in military planning?
It just depends how much authority and trust you put in your military. What's the relationship between government and military? For which Hugh is, of course, much better at preventing. Speak to me.
Well, what I would say for all states in 1914 is the mechanisms for managing your military are not sophisticated. The general phenomenon, particularly since the unification of Germany and the European desire to emulate German military success in the wars of German unification, is to establish general staffs. But those general staffs are planning bodies. Their jobs are to think about plans for the next war. That is precisely what their principal function. But nobody has yet worked out fully in any state how you integrate that into the machinery of government. You've created this really quite sophisticated bureaucracy in states that, remember, have comparatively small civil servants by the standards of our day, comparatively small numbers of officials. And here is a bureaucracy you create without any clear sense of how they will be managed and orchestrated. And so to that extent, when you get a crisis which might result in war, the link between war planning and how it will be used in diplomacy is not at all clear. People are making it up as they go along. And in particular, in July, it seems to me, actually the sort of war that they think they're fighting comes into the crisis really quite late. We've already really gone round that point.
And making it up as they go along.
Well, if I can just add to that. Firstly, it's an excellent question, this relationship between military planning and diplomacy. So firstly, the fact that as Annika has said, not just Germany, but all powers to a greater or lesser extent have some kind of a military plan, shows that we're living in a system of armed diplomacy. So that force and the resort to war is acceptable as the basis of diplomacy. But the question, of course, is when and whether you actually use that. And it's interesting that the July 1914 is an example, a terrifying example during the Cold War of the difficulties and the dangers of confrontation. One of the reasons why Robert Kennedy recommends Barbara Tuchman's book, The Guns of August, for reading in the White House during the Cuban Missile Crisis, is that if you think July 1914 plus nuclear weapons, then you have that kind of escalation. But on the other hand, if we think of the Munich crisis in 1938 and appeasement, one of the reasons appeasement happened was because the July crisis was in everybody's mind. Appease Hitler rather than risk 1914 all over again. And so in that sense, it seems to me that we have to think of 1914 in relation to Munich as representing the opposite ends of the spectrum in terms of appeasement or deterrence. And my final question would be the extent to which, and this is perhaps one, Annika, to you, to what extent is war even in the minds of the diplomats and the politicians in the July crisis? Or are they thinking first and foremost about a diplomatic confrontation in which, rather like in a duel, the point about a duel is you have to be prepared to fight a duel to uphold your honor and your prestige, but you hope that you won't have to do it. And it's the fact that you might, which means that hopefully you won't have to.
I'm sure we could all continue on, but we're running out of time, so I just want all of you, in 20 seconds each, please, to just answer a far more general question which we were talking about outside, about the relevance relevance of the Great War to today. You know, why do we all, this is the centenary that we're commemorating, but why do we all find it so interesting still, Tara?
It's so complex. The First World War changed the nature of the world, so looking back at it, it is crucial. There are arguments that there are parts of the world that are still being affected by the decisions made in the First World War.
Hugh, briefly.
This is a war which heightens our sense of all the ambiguities surrounding war. When is it right to go to war? When is it wrong to go to war? How do you end a war once you've begun it? The fact that the more you fight, the more difficult it becomes to give up. The fact that it's hard to get out of this war, that it doesn't end neatly, it ends in considerable confusion, that seems to me far more revealing about the nature of war than our caricature, the caricature we constructed of the Second World War, the good war.
Hasn't already been said. I think it's also when we're in a building like this, and many of you would have looked at the exhibition, it just still continues to be so moving. And I think when you look at the causes of the war, and you think actually perhaps, definitely it was not inevitable. So looking at what came from it, I think it just remains as relevant now as it was 100 years ago.
John.
Two very quick points. First, in terms specifically of what we've been debating this evening, the causes of the war, it's this contrast between, on the one hand, deterrence, and on the other hand, appeasement. And it seems to me that those are two kind of constants in foreign and military policy, and this crisis embodies them. But also, it's the impossibility of predicting the future. So what I found fascinating is the futurescapes with which these politicians and military figures acted in 1914, and the radically different outcome which occurred, which none of them predicted.
Well, we've ranged very widely, blame and responsibility, sleepwalking, we've looked at the relevance of it, we've looked at imperialism, we've looked at Europe, all the countries involved, from the Ottoman Empire to the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and I think we've ranged very widely. So now I'd like to ask all of you, if you now think that your knowledge and understanding of the outbreak of the Great War has increased, would you put your hands up, please? Hey, that's great. Well, I mean, at least 3/4 there, which is fantastic. Thank you. Before you go, just a reminder, because it will help people here to fill in those evaluation forms which you've all got on your seats. So it just remains for me to thank our panelists very, very much. Annika, John, Hugh, Tara, thank you. And of course, a big thank you to you for all your questions and for coming here and giving us such a great debate today. Thank you.
We caught up with the speakers and some of the students and teachers who were there to canvass their opinions on the topic and on the event itself. Tara, did the debate change any of your views on the causes of the Great War?
It's probably one of those that you don't automatically realise your changes, because it just broadens your understanding. I was pleased to find points of commonality, for example, the overemphasis on imperialism, but I hadn't been aware that was just a cyclical fashion trend.
Hugh, were there any questions from the students that surprised you in terms of their insight?
Yes, there were. I mean, you sort of expect questions about Germany and about the July crisis and about Sarajevo. I was very struck, though, by the question about the Ottoman Empire and its role, because I think that is an important question and one very easily omitted from the student point of view. And I think I was surprised, too, by the general level of sophistication. That sounds patronising, I don't mean it to be that at all. But, clearly they have thought a lot about it. And I think one of the great merits of the centenary has been that it has engaged both school pupils and, I think, probably their parents, because they've talked to their parents about it. And the level of awareness and the depth of knowledge that has come out of that has been really great. I mean, as a public education exercise, I think it's been wonderful. So it's not just the education that's happening at schools. I think, it goes more widely.
Professor Annika Mombauer, were there any questions from the students that surprised you in terms of their insight?
Definitely. I mean, for a start, to ask a question in an audience like that is really quite brave. It's very intimidating to be surrounded by so many people. So it's wonderful that they're asking all those questions. And they were all really good questions. They thought about the topic from lots of different angles, but also asked them specific questions of detail. So it was really, really great.
How important do you think it is to have events like this to help engage students in history?
I think it's very important. I think speaking to the students who've been here, I think they have found it very useful. Talking about the sort of interpretations we've had, it's getting to understand how the debates about history have changed. Many of them are thinking about applying to Oxbridge as well for history, and it gives them an indication what the debate and the level of debate will be like when they go to university as well. And I think that's helped to really give them an insight that actually it's not going to be something that's going to be sort of blow their minds. They will be able to cope with it, because I think a few of them were nervous when they came in, and they now got an idea what debate is like at this level.
What did you think of the debate? Did you find it interesting?
I thought the debate was really, really interesting. All the different panellists gave fascinating answers, and the answers they gave were also different, and they all gave different perspectives that, when they came together, really improved my understanding of the issues at stake. And it's such an important historical event that I'm really glad I came to the debate, and it was a really good opportunity.
Did attending this event make you think about history in a different way?
I think for me it really kind of highlighted the difference in perspective. Just whilst they kind of had similar views, just the idea that in history it's kind of made up of all these different ideas. So it's useful to have events that kind of showcase that.
My thanks to Sir Hugh Strachan, Professor Annika Mombauer, Tara Finn and Professor John Horn. Further debates will take place in Leicester, Leeds, Brighton, Bangor, Barry, Newcastle, Edinburgh, Exeter, Cambridge and Birmingham until March 2017. Other key issues to be addressed across the series include the impact of the Great War on female emancipation, politics in the Middle East and the lives of Catholics and Protestants in Northern Ireland.